And so welcome to part 2 of your feedback, Linda. And when we were in part 1, when we were looking at some of the contributory factors to the puckering that you'd experience, and we covered some actions to prevent and control that puckering effect when working with these full coverage fills, which you're running at a full density rather than a light density. And top of the list, of course, is always hooping. Good hooping, nice and secure. Next comes stabilizers, using the appropriate one, and of course looking at the tension settings on machines for both top and bottom thread is always worth a look. So we considered digitizing options, and the first couple of digitizing options that we considered were how to read how the stitching's running and having a think about underlays, the direction of the underlays, sometimes even the type of stitches that those underlays consist of, as well as perhaps going as far as making your own underlays, and in the extreme case taking out the automatic underlay altogether and applying a mesh underlay if you feel that that's what's appropriate. And then there's another technique as well which actually affects the cover stitches, and it's how you lay those down, and that's called layering, and that's what I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about now. And by layering, this is what I mean. So I've taken the body section here, and if we take a look at this here, and I'm just going to close this down so that I can show you how to open it up. When you look at your resequence bar, quite often what you'll see is when you're looking at your objects is that if you click this little box here that says more, it brings up the type of stitch, and it also brings the number of stitches that are in the object. And so what you're actually going to do is you're going to split the stitching of this. So instead of it doing underlay and then putting all the fill stitches in one go, what we're actually going to do is we're going to say, right, we'll put the underlay down, and then what we'll do is we'll put the top layer in at a lighter density, and then we'll put another layer in the other way. So the way it would work would be that the blue layer would possibly fill down, and then the red layer would come back. And because they sit slightly, ever so slightly offset from each other, the red layer as it goes back up will fill the gaps. Now I'm talking red layer and blue here, but that's what you do for actually setting up your layers so that you get them in the right place. And obviously you have to sample and test them, but then of course what happens is that you would take them and that and whatever underlay it is that you'd put underneath of them, and you'd make them all into the same colour. So even though it's 3 different layers of a separate layer of underlay, your first run at half density, your second run at half density, if it's all the same colour, it looks like it's the same object. And this layering technique is very, very effective once you've done your sampling and you've actually tweaked it and got the positioning of it exactly right. It's very effective for when we are using very big areas of a full density fill stitch. Now, in terms of how to actually make that and do that, I've already covered it. It's also exactly the same technique that you use for doing a manual colour grading when you're wanting an even colour, whether it be 2 colours or 3 colours. It's exactly the same principle. And in the email that I send you, I'll give you a link to Fiona's video part 2, and the technique that I'm talking about is right at the beginning of that video, and it's the colour grading that I was talking about on the apples there, but it's exactly the same principle as here. And in reality what you actually do is you look at your original, you take off the underlay, you look at how many stitches there are and what stitch density you've got set, and then you fiddle around until you get a stitch density that it gives you roughly half the number of stitches. You copy it, you paste it, and then you just nudge it up a tiny little bit so that the threads mesh together as though they were actually filled as one object. Next we'll move on to your other issue, which was the fun that you had with the padded satin stitch that you used here on the beak, on the heart, and of course on each of Mr. Owl's toes. And of course on your second stitch out, when you did the heart, which is on top of the fill, by the time that you'd got all the padding on, you had to stop the machine because it was getting hung up on the stitches here, because obviously the padding, and I think you're a little bit concerned as to why that would happen. So we'll take a look at that now. Now what I've done here is just highlighted the objects that you digitized with the padded satin fill, and we're just going to take a look at the settings of these because they're ever so slightly different. This first one here, the beak, I want you to notice here 0.36 on your density and 3 layers with an underlay of an edge run and zigzag. The heart is 0.36 again, but this time 4 layers of cover stitch and an underlay of an edge run and zigzag. And the little claws, and each of these is exactly the same, so we'll only look at one. And on this one again, you've got the padded satin set at 0.36 with 3 layers of the cover stitching, but this time you only have a zigzag underlay underneath. And my guess is that as regards the density that you used on the padded satin stitch, you left it as what the program had offered you, and that's possibly what part and parcel of the problem that you experienced. If we get time, I'll have a look at maybe showing you where that 0.36 comes from, because each time you have a different auto fabric set, this amount that's offered you as the starting point can be different. Anyway, let's take a look at how padding stitch actually stitches out. And I've got 3 here. This is a 3-layer one, again 0.36. They're all at 0.36, which is the basic density that is offered when you have an auto fabric that is pure cotton, the default that the machine gives you when it loads a new template. So that's where the 0.36 comes from. If I was to use a different fabric, that would probably be a different value in there. It doesn't mean that you can't change it, and in fact that's what we have to do. Let's take a look at how this stitches out. As soon as I put the player on, I'm going to slow it down and we'll watch how it forms. So that's the zigzag. This is the pad going in. And then next will come 4 layers of a satin stitch, each one getting progressively larger towards the outside boundary of the shape that's been digitized. So layer 1, let's speed it up again now a little bit, layer 2, and each one of these densities is at 0.36. That's layer 3, again slightly bigger, the hump's getting higher, layer 4, and the end of the shape comes with a tie-off stitch. On to number 5, edge run, zigzag, now comes the pad, and then there will be 5 layers of cover stitching. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I'm going to stop it here and then we'll talk about these next ones. Okay, if we were going to build our own padded satin stitch, then the way we'd go about it would be, let's just ignore that. Okay, first of all, that would be the outline, which is a single run line, and it's the edge run. Then that same shape there, and we would have a fairly wide space, sort of tatami or zigzag, to act as the underlay. Next we would set up the pad, and the way in which this one's been set up is on a mesh. If I zoom in, you'll be able to see this. I haven't done it as a satin. I learnt to do this as a mesh. I'll take it a little higher. There you go. So 1 cover stitch with an underlay going in that direction underneath, so you get that crisscross effect. It's basically a loose density weave fill. And then the next one that you do is layer 1, and if you look, I've set that at density 0.5. Layer 2, I've set it density 0.45, and then the top covering layer, which is the full size again over the pad, I have at 0.43. And because this top layer here is covering all of these underneath, I do have it as a slightly closer density than these, but because it's going over a firm pad and we've got these layers underneath, these underneath layers, if you digitize them yourself, don't need to be that high. So when we actually look at this one here, if we totaled up these stitches here, I've already done this here, and then I've reset the density of this particular shape. It's all I did was I copy pasted one of these down here and then altered the density setting on it to 0.43, and that gives me 468 stitches in it compared with 539 for the same object in 3 layers there. So perhaps that explains to you why you are experiencing problems with your embroidery building up to such a point and your stitches getting caught underneath, and it's because there were too many stitches. The density was far too tight, far too low. So again, it's an experiment and sample situation, but it is worth having a go. So back with your design, I mentioned this business about auto fabrics, and your design, if I look here, when you digitized it, you opened it with the standard template that Digitizer 5 provides for you, and that is actually set up to give you pure cotton. So if we go over and have a look and say, what sort of settings do Janome Digitizer give you in your object properties box as a starting point, and this is where it's set up when your object properties is done. There are some different tabs. The tatami, so when you see this, this is the settings that you get here when it's set for pure cotton. Wide satin, now unfortunately that's set at 90%, and in here of course it reads at 0.36. 100% comes up at 0.4. On the website I have put on the wiki page here we go, these settings, if anybody's actually interested in looking at them, that's how they translate, because on auto fabric settings they've put them in percentages, but that's actually displayed in object properties as this. So if anybody actually wanted to make their own auto fabric, which is what I've done, and then set it up as a new normal template for when they're doing their digitizing, so that they don't have to keep altering these settings, then that information could be quite handy. Narrow satin, again it's at 90%, which shows up at this 0.36. It also sets up your lettering, and there's an information box at the end which is your stabilizer topping. Anyway, Linda, I'm mindful that in exploring the issues that you've encountered, that we've delved down into quite some detail in this feedback review. I do hope that you find some of it useful for your digitizing in the future, but at the end of the day, you know, you've done a pretty good job here. The pathing's excellent, and the visual representation that you did, and especially with this tie, you know, he looks cute, he really does, and I do want to know how you actually did that tie. So, as I say, I do hope that you find some of it useful.